Okay, in this lecture, I'm going to uncover EDMX or Entity Data Model. So back in Visual Studio, this EDMX designer is essentially a visual representation of an XML. Let me show you its content as XML. First, we need to close this diagram because we cannot have the same file open both in the designer and in the XML editor. So close. Now we go to Solution Explorer. Right-click the EDMX file, open with XML text editor. So here's the content of our EDMX file. We have two main sections here, runtime and designer. The designer section includes data about the visual representation of this EDMX. So if we zoom in the diagram, or if we move entities around, anything that we do visually will be represented here. The runtime section includes everything about our model. So let me expand that. Here we have three subsections. Storage models, which is the representation of our database. Conceptual models, which is the representation of our entities. And mappings, which is of course the mapping between these two models. This is the core of an object relational mapper like Entity Framework. An object relational mapper, or ORM, knows how to map an object-oriented model to a relational model. Let's take a deeper look at each of these sections here. So under storage models, there is data about our database, our tables, our columns. Here is an example. So we have a table called authors, which has a primary key called author ID, and two columns, author ID and name. Author ID is of type integer. It's an identity column, and it's not nullable. The name column is a varchar with the length of 255 characters, and it's not nullable. So the storage model section knows everything about our database schema. Let's take a look at our conceptual model. So in our conceptual model, we have an entity called author, which has a key called author ID. It has two properties, author ID and name. Author ID is of type int32. It's not nullable and it's an identity column. And the name is a string with maximum length of 255 characters. So as you see, currently our conceptual model is very close to our storage model or our database model, but it doesn't have to be. We can change our conceptual model, and the mapping section, as I will show you in a second, will ensure that our conceptual model can be mapped to our storage model. Let's take a look at the mapping part. So here's an example. We have a table called authors, which is mapped to an entity called author. And here's the mapping. Author ID property is mapped to author ID column. The name property is mapped to name column. So as I said, we can change our conceptual model, and the mapping will make sure that our conceptual model can be persisted into our storage model. So this is the essence of our EDMX. It's essentially an XML that knows everything about the database, our conceptual model, the mapping between the two, and any changes we have done in our designer. Now let's get back to our designer again. So close this. And here. So what you see currently on the designer is purely the entities. You don't see the storage model or the mapping. So how do we see them in a visual way? Well, for mapping, you right-click on an entity and select Table Mapping. So this entity is mapped to a table called Authors. We can change the mapping. We can map it to a different table if it makes sense. So we simply select it from this list. And these are all the tables in our database that our EDMX or Entity Data Model knows about. And here are the column mappings. So author ID column in the database is mapped to author ID property in our conceptual model. And here's the mapping for the name. I can choose to remove the mapping. For example, I might have a property in my conceptual model that I don't want to persist. Maybe it's a calculated property. I can simply come here and delete it. With this, we tell Entity Framework to ignore this property. Don't worry about mapping it to the database. Now I'm going to revert this back. So, map to name. So here's the mapping part. What about our storage model? Do we have a visual representation of that? Yes, we do, but it's in a different place. So let's close this. We right click here on an empty area and select Model Browser. So this tree structure that you see here is exactly what you saw earlier in the XML. So Pluto model is our conceptual model. Here we have our entities. Author, course, whatever. You can expand it, see its properties. And under Pluto model.store, we have the storage model. So here's the list of tables and views. We have a section for stored procedures and functions, and one for constraints. We'll gradually get more familiar with these elements throughout this section. So, the takeaway from this lecture is that an entity data model is an XML that knows everything about our database model, our conceptual model, the mapping between the two, and any settings about visually representing our entities.